All right, good morning, folks. Another very exciting episode of Access Granted, and today we are going to be taking some practical examples of how do you secure non-human identities. Topic that sounds a little bit robotic, but it's all human when things go wrong and you run into a security issue. We have been doing a couple of podcasts on non-human identities. We invited CEO of NHI Management Group, Lalit. We had CEO of Britive Art, who also joined us, and we had several discussions on non-human identities with John Morton, field CTO, Britive as well. But today, what we are going to do is we're going to make it a little bit real. So for people to really take an example of a use case, a practical use case that normally infrastructure teams use it on a daily basis. And we talk about how do you secure non-human identities within the realm of that particular use case. And that use case is GitHub. GitHub is something that customers use on a daily basis to do their software development lifecycle. And there are non-human identities that gets leveraged as part of the CI/CD. And there's no better person than Palak Chheda, who is a principal architect in Britive and works with the cloud repos all day and have seen things, GitHub do things that they should not be doing. But there's no better person than for him to be here and explain us what are the NHIs in the GitHub, what are the risks and how do you secure them in a very practitioner's point of view. Palak, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Naman. Excited to be talking about this and also showing our capabilities, right? So, very rarely we get a chance to show something in action. So, I'm looking forward to it. We are recording this on Monday morning. So, hopefully, things are all nicely baked in the demo. There is always a curse of a live demo, which I hope will not be the case today.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So before we go deeper into this podcast, and we'll try to keep this one short, but tell us, what do we mean by non-human identities in a GitHub world, right? So why do they get used, and what are some of the risks that get associated with those non-human identities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of look at it at two ways, right? There is one, the identity of that workload or a GitHub Actions workload itself. And this could be anything outside of GitHub as well, right? But any kind of automation, CI/CD pipeline. So there is a mechanism to a kind of a way to identify that workload itself. So that's one, right, which is not a human. It is kind of doing its automated process on a periodic basis. And two, are probably the access that it needs to connect to your various infrastructure components. So whether there are, S3 buckets in AWS or some Cloud SQL queries that it needs to run in GCP, what have you. So the other component is the access that it's, right? And the access it needs are kind of local to your cloud infrastructure or any infrastructure that this pipeline is connecting to. So in a way, there are always two things to protect. One, the identity of that workload itself, and two, the access that it has. And both obviously can be tied together because it's the same workload making those calls or taking actions. But in a way, I kind of see it as, two different kind of, non-human identities at play in a typical kind of GitHub Actions workflow. Right. And there could be many more based on how complex your workload is and things like that. But yeah, I think those are, I think, two good places to start.
Got it, got it. So basically, by the nature of it, a GitHub workflow would have access to the critical infrastructure, critical assets, critical servers, critical databases as part of that workflow. And if you have a leaked GitHub token or an API key that anybody or any threat actor will get, then basically you are exposing all of your critical data infrastructure. That's why it's so critical to secure them. I got it. So maybe we can jump into some live demo of a sample use case where a GitHub action is, doing something, and you can explain us what those NHIs are and how do you secure them with a tool like Britive.
Yes, absolutely. Um, all right. So what you're looking at here is essentially an example of GitHub Actions workload using a workload identity, right, to federate itself to Britive and get short-lived credentials for the cloud service provider. In this case, it is a GitHub Actions workflow, and the GitHub has a capability to kind of create a short-lived ID token for that workload, right? So on every run, there is a short-lived OIDC or a JOT token being created for that workload. Now, your workload can use that token to authenticate itself to Brightive, right? And that's where Brightive now doesn't require you to carry Brighteve's API key or a long-lived authentication mechanism to authenticate to Brightive, right? So now, just because of the workload federation and how the GitHub Actions workflow is able to authenticate to Brightive, we've kind of eliminated the first long-lived secret, right? So that's kind of the secret that we were talking about, how workload will authenticate to Britive, right? So now Britive is able to authenticate the federated workload and verify the policy that this workload has access to, right? So based on our kind of common policy framework, now the workload has access to say certain attributes or certain elements within your cloud service provider's infrastructure, right? So our policy would verify what access this specific workload has, and if that policy comes back as true, we will create short-lived service principals and short-lived credentials in case of say AWS short-lived access keys for that workload to do the job it needs to do, right? So in these three steps, Brightive is essentially creating that short-lived session keys for the workload to use and passing those session keys back to the workload to use those credentials, right? And at that point, the workload now has the second service principal kind of what we alluded to earlier, and that service principal allows the workload to do the actions or take the actions in CSP on AWS, GCP, or whatever Brighter is protecting at that point. And in all of this, the idea is that really there is no static keys, there are no long-lived permissions, or there are no API keys or really to anything to share. So we are eliminating not only like long-lived permissions, but also long-lived access tokens or authenticators in a way where now everything is ephemeral in nature. So reducing kind of the attack surface and also the overall um, kind of the blast radius for any kind of things to go really wrong here. So that's essentially what this use case allows us to do, and the power of Workload Federation is kind of allows us to kind of replicate the same behavior or the same use case with multiple actions workflow like GitLab or even Jenkins and others, and achieve the similar results with Brightive and how powerful Brightive can be in providing short-lived access credentials for workloads.
That's great, Palak. So let me, I'm just trying to break it down and easy to understand. So let's say in cases where you do not have Brightif and you only have the left hand side, which is the GitHub, and you have the cloud providers where GitHub is trying to make changes, you would have to maintain some sort of static tokens or API keys, which if threat actor is able to get hold of, then basically you have everything exposed in your database, your Kubernetes clusters or anything that this GitHub is trying to take actions to. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you will have obviously have some controls in defining the policies at the cloud service provider. But at the end of the day, you might still rely on long-lived tokens, all right, or long-lived session keys to be able to connect to that service provider, right? And you don't have a good automated way of kind of destroying the service principals or destroying that short-lived session credentials, right? For the workload. So that's something that you gain from Brightive. And obviously, as the things scale, right, a solution like Brightive will allow you to kind of replicate this for lot of workloads, right? That's where kind of a unified policy framework and a unified assignments of these permissions to hundreds of, say, workloads could be fairly simple for a tool like Brightive to achieve.
Got it. Got it. Got it. So in the simple ways, what we are saying is GitHub, when it's trying to take an action to a database or to a Kubernetes cluster or to update S3 bucket, what we are saying is it will first authenticate itself to Britif. So Britif knows it's a trusted entity. And then instead of leveraging those static credentials and API keys, Britif will provide them a very a temporary and ephemeral base, a short-lived a token and keys that's only valid for that particular action, and it gets revoked once the job is done. Is that correct understanding?
Yes, absolutely. That is correct. Yeah. And this can also be that if your workload is much more complex, Brightive could be giving you session tokens for multiple CSPs at a time, right? Or multiple infrastructure components at the time. So that way, even having something like Brightive is critical because now at every step of the workload, you are able to get short-lived credentials for different service providers, right? Through Brightive and the policy enforcement that Brightive provides.
That's fantastic. I can see that how significantly it can reduce the risk because you no longer have a 24/7 God mode account where a threat actor can get hold of and then start to literally move inside your environment. Uh, but can you show us how things actually work in the actual environment? Maybe give us a live
Yeah, definitely. So we have a very canned website here, right? So this website is basically rendered from a simple HTML file stored on an S3 bucket, right? And that S3 bucket is something that is being updated by our GitHub Actions workflow, right? So in this piece of code here, we have one HTML file upon which if a change is made to that HTML file, that file has to be updated on the S3 bucket so that the right website or the right portal is rendered, right? So here I'm going to make a small change on the portal itself or on the website code. I'm going to maybe say change something here where we are saying your dog's happiness is our only priority. I'm going to say that's our first priority instead, right? Because we might have many priorities. So I'm going to commit this code. And as soon as I commit this code, the GitHub Actions workflow will kind of go into action. And that's where kind of the power of Britive will come into play. So we are now looking at kind of the live demo of how this job is going to, take action and work, right? So in this case, it is going to set up the machine where it needs to do the things. It is going to set up the environment with the right environment tools. Obviously, something like this doesn't have to happen at every action or every deployment. But in this case, we are trying to demonstrate all the things that this is going to do. Right? So here it is basically setting up an environment for itself, installing our CLI to interact with Brightive, and now it is going to check out a short-lived AWS profile, right? So this Brightive profile is going to allow this actions workflow to create a short-lived session keys, right? So here you will see that these short-lived session keys and tokens were created for this workload. Now we are openly sharing this and the information on the call here because the idea is that these tokens are going to expire in 15 minutes, right? So now everything is ephemeral, and these short-lived tokens were created for this workload for this specific deployment on a short amount of time for by Brightive, right? So upon this checkout of a Brightive profile, those short-lived access keys were created. Now workload was able to use AWS CLI to deploy the changes on the S3 bucket. And once it is done that, it can come in and check in those credentials back, right? And as soon as this check in, those credentials are invalidated by Brightive. And even though these credentials are either in the logs or in the deployment, they are worthless, right? Because those credentials have already expired. And the Brightive check-in action basically allows us to achieve that. Now, if I go back and refresh this website, let's see if the changes have taken place and the website gets updated or not, right? So if I refresh, yeah, so now instead of it saying our only priority, it says it's our first priority. So it's a very, very short example where a GitHub Actions workflow is automatically kicked off by a change we made or the code change that was deployed or committed to in the main repo. And now our website is updated by the GitHub Actions workflow. And all of this happened kind of ephemerally based on the Brighter service credentials that were provided to the workload.
That's great example, Palak. Thanks for showing this. I think it just brings everything together. I can see that the secrets that Brightive is providing is not something which is stored in some sort of like a vault or static vault where you are doing a 30-day rotation and you have a service account, which is normally what legacy customer do. This is basically on the fly, getting you ephemeral token or API key that becomes invalidated after its use. So it's very, I would say, secure. And I feel this is a great example of what Gartner have started to call ZSP, zero standing privileges, which is what the new North Star of protecting your identities, both human and non-human.
Like I've been a big fan of, zero standing permissions, right? Since I got introduced to the idea. People always spoke about like just-in-time access, but nobody spoke about zero standing permissions the way we saw kind of, is kind of the future, right? So yeah, we are kind of now happy that, people are starting to recognize the power of just zero standing privileges as opposed to just-in-time access, because just-in-time access could mean a lot of things, right? But nobody talks about pulling those permissions back or getting your infrastructure to a status of kind of least privilege or zero standing permissions for things that are not in use or the permissions that are not really required for any of your human or non-human identities.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love this ZSP concept, and it's going to become a critical part of overall zero trust security posture that the enterprises are looking forward to. Let me ask you this question. So, if I am a user, and I want to implement something like this, two questions. One is basically all the things that are happening as part of this GitHub action workflow and how the NHIs are actually checking in, checking out permissions. Am I able to see this in some sort of an audit or a log or a report? And second is, if I want to start something and start locking down my NHIs, is there a way where I can have a visualization of what do I have in my network first? So I can have a view of, okay, these are my 20 NHIs that are being used, and I want to make sure that there is no static things associated to that and make it all GSP. So how would I go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that brings us to kind of Britive UI itself. So here you're looking at the example of a GitHub Actions federated identity. So for every repo that needs access to certain components is registered at Britive. And this registration is what allows us to kind of enforce the policy for individual workloads, right? Or individual NHIs. And in that case, as soon as we have information about this, and obviously all of this can be created through our APIs and our SDK. So when you are registering new repos, they are automatically made available within Brightive to view it, right? And now this policy enforcement allows us to now identify this individual non-human identity and assign it only the access that it needs, right? So that access assignments and policy enforcement happens within Brightive. Now, if I look at the audit logs, right, things that we already did with this current workload, right? Including from, say, profile checking out to profile check-in, everything is audited within Brightive. And this is also shipped in the near real time to NSM solutions as well, right? So every action this workload did right here a few seconds ago is already available in the audit log locally, which you can use to alert certain systems, send certain webhook actions, workflows to kind of replicate this information in other places, or even send it to SIM solution to aggregate the logs, right? So all of those actions are happening right here, and everything is audited and logged and made available to you, right? So that's how, like, having a tool like Brightive at play kind of help achieve not only kind of the enforcement, but also visibility of what the workload is doing and how often it is doing what it is doing.
Interesting. That's very very powerful, because if an auditor comes to me tomorrow and say, okay, show me, all the things that your NHIs have done in last, let's say, week, I should be able to come here and show them all the audit trace of everything that the NHI has taken or checked out, any permission or what task they have done. It's very powerful.
Absolutely. Yes.
Um, one more question I have is, let's say if I want to see how many NHIs are there and what has a high risk associated to them, is there a way I can see it in Brightif where it has a view of, you can break it down to non-human entities, and at least you have some understanding of what type of permissions do they have?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So as Brightive kind of scans your environment, we are keeping tab of like high level or sensitive permissions in your environment. So here I'm showing an example of Azure, where I can look at kind of, things like global administrators, security administrators, automatically tagged as high risk. And I can look at what accounts or service principals they are assigned. Now, somebody might feel like, okay, there is not a lot of assignments here. How is that possible? And essentially, that's where the zero standing permissions is at play, right? So not a lot of these accounts, or sorry, permissions are assigned persistently to various accounts, right? So that's one. The other one is, for every service principal, there is a log in Brightive as to how that service principal is created, when it was created, when it has been changed or not at all. So all of that is readily available right within Brightive, right? And as we kind of continuously monitor and scan your environment, we also look at the delta changes, right? That's where, like, the unchanged or changed status can help you kind of dig a little bit further as to how the access or the workload has changed over time, and how these service principles are being used, right? And provides you an opportunity to make some of these service principles also ephemeral by letting Brightive create these short-lived service principles only when they are needed, only when they are in use.
That's brilliant. So I have a view where I can actually come and look at all the service principals, service accounts, or NHI that are there in my system, and I can do something about them as a starting point.
Absolutely.
That's great. That's great. So maybe we can bring this to a closure. We wanted to keep it a little short so that it's watchable. So tell us, break it down for us, Palak. That how does this change the game for security teams? Because I know that developers, DevOps, they love non-human identities, but sometimes security teams lose their sleep on it. So what do you think? How does it change the game for security teams and for developers? I want to make sure that this is not adding an extra step to their productivity and still they're keeping it efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I definitely believe in, like, security should be the simplest way. So the most secure way should always be the simplest way to achieve things. So because of how the industry is moving and how standards like Workload Federation are taking shape, they are very, very friendly to developer. They're very cloud friendly, helping you kind of move at the cloud speed. So essentially, Britive is just the extension to that. By the means of having our SDK available, our CLI available, you are able to achieve a lot of these use cases, or pretty much everything you want to do with an idea of zero standing permissions is kind of made available and made simple for all of the security folks as well as the developers to kind of consume, right? And this blog that we have written kind of elaborates this further and also talk through the same use case that we showed today in this blog, right? So it's a very short read and allows you to basically understand how the workload federation is working, why it is used and how it is used, and how you can make use of Brightive to kind of secure hundreds and thousands of workloads, by Bright's common access policy.
Fantastic. And so that was the fantastic discussion, Palak. And I think the good thing about this is you show us in real time, right, how actual real world use case like GitHub NHIs are secured. Obviously, in this case through Brightif, just in time privilege access management platform. But the key thing also is that it was not inhibiting any of the developers' efficiency. It was efficient. It was friendly for developers. And obviously, security team loves it because now you're able to secure those non-human identities and reduce the risk of static credentials and over permissive accounts, which is pretty much every customer that I talk to, they're looking to reduce that risk. Right. So I guess the message from us to everybody is if you're using long-lived GitHub tokens, it's almost like playing a game of security roulette.
Yeah.
Risk and issues can happen anytime. So big thanks to Palak for helping us go through this demo and understand that it's not just about why NHI, it's about how NHI, how do you secure them, how do you visualize them, and can you take actions today to secure them, which is basically a top of the mind for almost every security and CISOs. Thanks a lot, Palak. Really appreciate you doing a little bit heavy lifting to showcase and build this demo and showing it to our audience.
Absolutely. Yeah, not a problem. And I would just like to say, we are available here to chat through any of your use cases. Any questions you have, reach us out to understand this further. And also, if there are any use cases that we are not able to meet today, nothing stopping us from, doing better, doing more than what we do today in the future, right? So, would love to hear any kind of feedback and also any questions that you might have through our communication channels.
Fantastic. Thank you, Palak. And for the audience, catch you next time on Access Granted. Take care.
All right. Thank you.